What if everything you thought you knew about medieval women was wrong? Did they truly have no voice, no power, no life beyond the shadows? Let's uncover the astonishing truths about women in the Middle Ages from the 5th to the 15th century. Number 9, women were entirely confined to the home and domestic duties. You might have heard that women in the Middle Ages were always stuck at home, only doing chores like cooking and cleaning, but historical records paint a totally different picture. From bustling cities to quiet villages, medieval women were out in the world doing all sorts of jobs and contributing in major ways to their communities and economies. In the lively towns and cities of medieval Europe, women were everywhere in the marketplace. They ran shops, handled finances, and dealt with customers just like men did. Consider the city of Paris in the 13th and 14th centuries. Tax records from this era show hundreds of women listed as independent business owners. They were running bakeries, selling wine, tailoring clothes, and working as money changers. These women were not just helping their husbands, they were the heads of their own businesses, managing employees, and making a living for themselves and their families. The Dames de la Halle in Paris were a powerful group of market women who controlled the city's food supply, regulating prices and quality. They even had their own unique legal privileges and protections. Brewing ale was another huge industry, and it was often dominated by women. Before hops became widely used, ale was a staple drink for everyone, a key part of the medieval diet. Women known as brewsters or alewives produced vast quantities of ale, selling it from their homes or at market stalls. In many towns, nearly every other household had a woman brewing ale for sale. The records from places like England and Flanders show women being fined for selling bad ale or charging too much, proving they were active and recognized participants in this widespread trade. Their economic contribution was essential to the daily lives of medieval people. Textile production was another major employer of women. From spinning wool into yarn to weaving cloth and dyeing fabrics, women were at the heart of this industry. The humble distaff and spindle were constant companions for women of all social classes, even while performing other tasks. In Flanders, a hub of medieval textile production, women worked in workshops as weavers and fullers. Guild records from cities like Ghent and Bruges list women as members, sometimes in women-only guilds, or as inheritors of their husbands' guild memberships, allowing them to continue and manage the family business after a man's death. This meant they had economic independence and the right to train apprentices. Moving beyond the cities, rural women were just as busy. On farms and manors, women were indispensable. They worked alongside men in the fields, plowing, sowing seeds, and harvesting crops. They managed vegetable gardens, raised livestock like chickens and pigs, and processed agricultural products. Making cheese and butter, grinding grain, and preserving food for the winter were all key tasks that ensured the survival of the household and the community. The rhythms of the farming year meant women were involved in nearly every aspect of food production, from sunup to sundown. These archaeological finds from medieval farmsteads include tools specific to women's agricultural work, such as churns for butter and presses for cheese. Even noblewomen, often seen as isolated in their castles, had extensive responsibilities outside of purely domestic matters. When their husbands were away fighting wars or at court, noblewomen were left in charge of vast estates. They managed the finances, oversaw the tenants, dealt with legal disputes, and ensured the smooth running of complex households. They were skilled administrators, often literate and capable of complex accounting. Examples like Eleanor of Aquitaine show women ruling vast territories and leading political negotiations, though on a much grander scale. Even less prominent noblewomen regularly handled the daily operations of their estates, which were essentially large businesses. They supervised dozens or even hundreds of servants, artisans, and laborers. For women in religious life, particularly abbesses, their roles extended far beyond simple piety. Abbesses were powerful figures who managed large monastic communities that often included vast landholdings. They oversaw estates, collected rents, administrated justice, and even had seats in parliaments or councils in some regions. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was not only a mystic and composer, but also a respected advisor to emperors and popes. She corresponded with powerful figures across Europe and managed a thriving monastery with numerous properties and administrative duties. Other abbesses ran hospitals, schools, and scriptoria where nuns produced illuminated manuscripts and copied texts, making significant contributions to the preservation of knowledge. Furthermore, women worked in professions that might surprise you. There were female scribes and illuminators who produced books, a highly skilled and valuable trade. Women were active as midwives and healers, holding vital knowledge about medicine and childbirth. Some medieval hospitals were run by women, who provided care for the sick and poor. We even find records of women working in construction, assisting masons and laborers, and participating in other physically demanding trades. The idea of medieval women as passive, housebound figures is a modern invention that ignores the rich and diverse reality of their lives. From running sophisticated businesses to toiling in the fields, from managing vast estates to leading spiritual communities, women were active, integral, and often powerful participants in the economic and social fabric of the Middle Ages. Their work was not just complementary to men's, but often the foundation upon which entire communities thrived. Records from various towns and regions provide countless examples of women listed independently in tax rolls, court documents, and guild records, demonstrating their autonomy and crucial contributions. Number 8. Education was denied to women. Many people believe that women in the Middle Ages were universally illiterate and had no access to learning. This is a common misconception that overlooks the vibrant intellectual lives many medieval women led. While formal university education was largely restricted to men, various avenues for learning existed for women, and many women achieved remarkable levels of literacy and scholarship. For noblewomen, education was a practical necessity. And managing large estates, supervising numerous servants, and participating in courtly life required a good deal of literacy and numeracy. They needed to read and write letters, keep accounts, and understand legal documents. Tutors were often brought into noble households to educate both sons and daughters. Many noble girls learned Latin, the international language of scholarship, law, and the church. They studied religious texts, literature, and sometimes even subjects like history and arithmetic. An example is Christine de Pizan, an educated woman in 14th and 15th century France, who wrote extensively about women's history and potential, challenging common misogynistic views of her time. Her father, a respected scholar, ensured she received a thorough education. In religious orders, convents were centers of learning for women. Nuns received comprehensive educations, often comparable to or even surpassing that of some male clergy. They learned to read and write in Latin, studied theology, philosophy, and classical literature. Many convents maintained impressive libraries, and nuns were involved in copying, illuminating, and even composing texts. Ratsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century German canoness, was a remarkable playwright and poet who wrote in Latin. Her works include historical narratives, lives of saints, and even comedies, making her one of the earliest known female dramatists in European history. Her writings show a profound classical education. Other notable abbesses like Harriet of Landsberg in the 12th century oversaw the creation of encyclopedic works like the Hortus Deliciarum, a massive illustrated compendium of knowledge ranging from theology to natural history, demonstrating the intellectual rigor of monastic education for women. Even outside the elite classes, literacy was more widespread among women than often assumed. In bustling urban centers, some girls attended schools. Parish schools and chantry schools, often associated with churches, sometimes admitted girls, especially for basic literacy and numeracy. In merchant families, daughters often learned to read and write to help with the family business. They handled correspondence, kept ledgers, and calculated transactions. The records from Italian merchant families, for instance, show daughters being taught to read and write, as their skills were valuable for the family enterprise. Some city ordinances mention schoolmasters being paid to teach both boys and girls. There is evidence of women owning and reading books. Inventories of personal possessions often list books among the belongings of women, not just religious texts, but also romances, histories, and practical guides. The rise of vernacular literature, texts written in common languages rather than Latin, made reading more accessible to a broader audience, including women. Many of the most popular medieval works, such as Arthurian romances and chansons de geste, were read aloud in noble courts and often enjoyed by women. Beyond formal schooling, many women gained practical knowledge and skills through apprenticeship and observation. Midwives and healers, for example, acquired extensive knowledge of anatomy, herbal remedies, and medical procedures through generations of oral tradition and hands-on experience. This practical education was crucial for community health and well-being. Artisan women learned complex crafts, from weaving intricate tapestries to preparing dyes, skills that required precision, knowledge of materials, and often mathematical understanding. The idea that medieval women were mostly uneducated comes from a focus solely on male-dominated universities and a narrow definition of literacy. When we look at convents, noble households, and urban workshops, we see that women had diverse opportunities for learning. Their intellectual contributions, from writing theological treatises to managing complex financial accounts, show that many medieval women were far from ignorant. They were active participants in the intellectual and cultural life of their times, shaping knowledge and contributing to the literary landscape in significant ways. The ability of women like Marie de France, a 12th century poet, to compose sophisticated narrative poems in French clearly indicates a high level of literacy and literary skill among some women. Her work continues to be studied today for its insight into medieval courtly life and gender roles. Number 7. All women were forced into marriage and had no say. The image of a medieval woman dragged unwillingly to the altar is a powerful one, but the historical reality of marriage in the Middle Ages was far more complex and nuanced. While arranged marriages were common, especially among the elite, women often had more agency and influence over their marital fates than commonly assumed. Consent, though sometimes interpreted differently than today, played a role, and other options existed beyond a forced union. For noble and royal families, marriage was primarily a political and economic alliance. Daughters were often used as pawns to secure lands, forge alliances, or consolidate power. In these circles, personal preference was often secondary to dynastic strategy. However, even here, a woman's refusal or strong dislike for a match could sometimes derail negotiations, especially if she had powerful relatives who supported her. Royal and papal dispensations were sometimes sought to break engagements that were seen as unsuitable. For instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, divorced her first husband, Louis VII of France, a testament to the fact that even queens were not entirely trapped, especially if they had political leverage. Her second marriage to Henry II of England was likely arranged, but also strategically beneficial for her. Church law, which heavily influenced medieval marriage practices, required the consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid. While this consent could be coerced, a marriage could be annulled if it was proven that one party was forced into it. This provided a legal avenue, albeit a difficult one, for women to challenge unwanted unions. Witnesses were often required for a marriage contract, and their testimony could be crucial in later annulment proceedings. Records from church courts show numerous cases of individuals seeking annulments based on lack of consent, prior contracts, or other impediments. This suggests that the concept of individual will in marriage was recognized, at least legally. Among the lower classes, particularly peasants and artisans, choice in marriage was often more pronounced. While parents still played a role in approving matches, especially concerning property or inheritance, young people often had more freedom to choose their partners. Marriages were frequently made within the same village or community based on personal acquaintance and mutual attraction. Court records show that young men and women sometimes eloped or formed unions without parental consent, though this could lead to disputes over dowry or inheritance. The concept of handfasting, a form of informal engagement or temporary marriage, also existed in some regions, allowing couples to test their compatibility before a formal church ceremony. Widowhood offered significant freedom and autonomy for women. A widow typically regained control over her dowry and dower property, which could be substantial. She was no longer under the legal guardianship of a husband and could manage her own finances, engage in business, and make decisions about her children's upbringing. Many wealthy widows chose not to remarry, enjoying their independence and economic power. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, negotiated with her husband to live a celibate life, a remarkable example of a woman asserting her will within marriage even though it involved unconventional terms. Many women who ran businesses or owned property in cities were widows, testament to the legal and economic freedom they gained. Entering a convent was another option for women who wished to avoid marriage or live a life dedicated to intellectual and spiritual pursuits. For some women, this was a conscious choice to escape the domestic sphere, gain an education, and live in a community of women. Convents provided intellectual and spiritual refuge, allowing women to become scholars, artists, and administrators, roles often unavailable to married women. Noble families sometimes sent daughters to convents as a form of social security or to ensure their spiritual well-being, but for the women themselves, it could be a pathway to autonomy. Furthermore, medieval literature, while often idealized, frequently depicted courtship and mutual attraction. While not always a mirror of reality, these stories suggest that ideas of love and partnership were not entirely absent from the medieval mind, even if practical considerations often overshadowed them. Love spells and charms, documented in folklore and some legal cases, also hint at a desire for personal influence in romantic pairings. It is inaccurate to paint all medieval marriages with a single brush of coercion. While social pressures, economic realities, and family expectations were undeniably powerful, women found ways to exert their agency. From appealing to church courts to choosing convent life or leveraging the power of widowhood, medieval women navigated the complexities of their marital options with varying degrees of success and independence. The nuances of medieval marriage reveal a society where women were not simply passive objects, but active participants in shaping their own destinies within the available frameworks of their time. Number 6, women had no legal rights or property ownership. The notion that medieval women had no legal rights or could not own property is a widespread but inaccurate simplification. While women's legal standing certainly differed from men's and varied significantly across regions and social classes, historical records show that medieval women possessed a surprising array of legal rights, including the ability to inherit, own, manage, and dispose of property. One of the most important legal avenues for women was the dowry and dower. A dowry was property or money brought by a bride to her marriage, often intended to support her and her children. While theoretically managed by the husband during the marriage, the dowry often remained legally hers and would revert to her or her family if the marriage ended in annulment or her husband's death. The dower, on the other hand, was a portion of her husband's property, typically 1/3 set aside for her use and income should she become a widow. This dower right was legally protected and ensured a widow's financial security, granting her significant independence. Many widows lived comfortably and managed these properties effectively for the remainder of their lives. Feudal law, which governed much of medieval Europe, allowed women to inherit land and titles. While male primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son was common, if there were no sons, daughters could inherit equally as co-heiresses. This is how powerful women like Eleanor of Aquitaine inherited vast territories, making her one of the wealthiest and most influential women in Europe. Even if a woman's inheritance passed to her husband upon marriage, she still retained legal rights to it, and it would typically revert to her or her children upon his death. Noblewomen were often skilled in managing these inherited lands, overseeing tenants, collecting rents, and administering justice within their domains. In urban centers, particularly in towns with evolving legal systems, women often had even greater legal and economic autonomy. Records from cities like Florence, London, and Cologne show women engaging in a wide range of legal activities. They bought and sold property, signed contracts, took out loans, and even sued and were sued in court. Single women and widows, in particular, enjoyed a legal status often referred to as feme sole, meaning woman alone, which granted them full legal capacity independent of any male guardian. This allowed them to operate businesses, enter into legal agreements, and manage their own financial affairs without requiring a husband's permission. Many successful female merchants and artisans were feme sole. Women also had rights concerning their children. While the father was generally the legal head of the household, a mother had significant rights regarding her children's upbringing, especially after her husband's death. Widows often acted as guardians of their minor children and managed their inherited estates until they came of age. They could also have a say in their children's marriages and careers. Wills from the period frequently show women making provisions for their children and leaving property to them, demonstrating their control over their own assets and their familial responsibilities. Even within marriage, where a wife's legal identity was often subsumed under her husband's in common law systems like England, women still retained certain protections and rights. A husband could not sell or mortgage his wife's dower property without her explicit consent. In some regions, laws protected a wife's personal property like her clothing or jewels from her husband's debts or creditors. A wife could also make a will with her husband's permission, or without it if she was a widow or in certain legal situations. But church courts also offered women a means to seek justice, particularly in matters of marriage, divorce, and personal morality. Women could initiate cases, bring forward witnesses, and argue for their rights in ecclesiastical courts, which often had jurisdiction over personal relationships and spiritual matters. This provided an alternative legal avenue when secular courts might not have been as accessible or favorable. The legal landscape for women in the Middle Ages was not monolithic. It varied greatly depending on location, social standing, and specific legal traditions. While a married woman in medieval England might have had fewer independent legal rights than a married woman in some parts of Italy, all women, especially widows and single women, held significant legal agency that is often overlooked. They were not simply chattel or possessions, but individuals with legal standing capable of owning land, running businesses, engaging in contracts, and defending their interests in court. The numerous surviving legal documents from the period provide concrete evidence of women's active participation in the legal and economic life of their times, challenging the simplistic narrative of their complete legal powerlessness. Number 5. Women had no political power or influence. The idea that medieval women were entirely excluded from politics and had no say in governance is a persistent myth. While direct participation in formal political bodies like parliaments was rare, women, particularly those of noble or royal birth, wielded substantial political power and influence, often behind the scenes but also openly as rulers, regents, and administrators. Queens were central figures in medieval politics. They were not just symbolic figures, they were often active partners in governance. Many queens served as regents when their husbands were away on crusade or war, or when their sons were too young to rule. In this capacity, they issued laws, commanded armies, managed royal finances, presided over courts, and conducted diplomatic negotiations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and later England, was perhaps the most famous example. She ruled her vast duchy of Aquitaine in her own right, accompanied her first husband on crusade, and played a significant role in the politics of both France and England. Later, she served as regent for her son, Richard the Lionheart, effectively governing England during his absence. Other notable queens like Blanche of Castile, regent for her son Louis IX of France, was a formidable politician who successfully defended the throne against rebellious nobles and negotiated crucial peace treaties. Beyond regency, some women ruled in their own right as queens regnant, duchesses, or countesses, particularly where Salic law, which prevented female inheritance, was not in force. The Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century ruler in Italy, commanded armies, managed a vast feudal territory, and played a pivotal role in the investiture controversy, a major political and religious conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. Her influence extended across large parts of Italy. Noblewomen, though not queens, also exerted significant political influence. As managers of vast estates in their husbands' absences, they often held quasi-governmental roles. They administered justice on their lands, collected taxes, raised military levies, and maintained order. They were key players in local and regional politics, forming alliances through marriages, hosting powerful guests, and engaging in patronage. The letters of wealthy noblewomen often show them actively engaged in political discussions, offering advice to their husbands, and lobbying for their interests at court. Some even led the defense of castles during sieges, like Countess Ida of Boulogne, who successfully defended her castle of Bouillon against attackers. Religious women also held considerable political power. Abbesses, especially of wealthy and influential convents, commanded significant resources and political leverage. They administered vast landholdings, which often meant they governed towns and villages, collected taxes, and administered justice over their tenants. Some abbesses held feudal obligations and provided knights or other services to their liege lords. They also had direct access to high-ranking clergy and secular rulers, and their advice was often sought on matters of state and church. Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier, was a highly respected political and spiritual advisor who corresponded with emperors, kings, and popes, offering her insights and critiques on matters of governance and morality. In urban settings, wealthy women, particularly widows who managed large businesses, sometimes played a role in civic politics. While they generally did not hold formal offices, their economic power and social standing gave them influence. They participated in guilds, which often had significant political clout in medieval towns, and their voices could be heard through petitions or informal lobbying. The Dames de la Halle in Paris, mentioned previously, were a powerful economic and social group who could influence market regulations and urban policies. Even at lower social levels, women sometimes had indirect political influence through their roles in households and communities. They might petition local lords or officials on behalf of their families or communities, providing vital information or expressing grievances. Women's protests and collective actions, though not formal politics, sometimes led to changes in local policies, especially concerning food prices or oppressive taxes. The idea that women were entirely devoid of political agency misunderstands the nature of medieval power. Power was not always exercised through formal titles and public office. It was often exercised through influence, wealth, land ownership, strategic alliances, and moral authority. Medieval women, from queens to abbesses to powerful noblewomen, expertly navigated these complex webs of power, proving themselves to be formidable political actors and shaping the course of history in ways that are often overlooked in traditional narratives focused solely on male rulers. Their influence was a tangible force in the medieval world. Number 4. Women were considered inherently evil or inferior based on religious doctrine. It is often suggested that medieval Christianity uniformly condemned women as inherently evil, weak, or intellectually inferior, solely based on interpretations of Eve's sin. While some influential male theologians certainly held misogynistic views and wrote critically about women, it is a vast oversimplification to say that medieval religious doctrine universally viewed women this way. Though Christian theology also upheld the spiritual equality of men and women, revered female saints, and provided women with unique avenues for spiritual and intellectual autonomy. The figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus, stands as the most powerful counterexample to the idea of universal female degradation in medieval Christianity. Mary was venerated as the purest, most exalted human being, held up as an ideal of virtue, humility, and divine grace. The cult of the Virgin Mary blossomed in the Middle Ages, leading to the construction of magnificent cathedrals dedicated to her, the creation of countless artworks, and the widespread devotion of common people. Mary was seen as the intercessor for humanity, a compassionate figure to whom both men and women prayed for guidance and salvation. Her purity and sinlessness directly countered any notion of women as inherently sinful. Beyond Mary, a vast number of female saints were revered throughout the Middle Ages. These included martyrs who showed incredible courage in the face of persecution, like St. Agnes and St. Catherine, as well as ascetics and mystics who achieved profound spiritual insights, like St. Bridget of Sweden and St. Clare of Assisi. These saints served as powerful role models for both men and women, demonstrating piety, wisdom, and spiritual strength. Their lives were celebrated, their relics venerated, and their stories told and retold, proving that spiritual excellence was not confined to one gender. That women founded religious orders, performed miracles, and offered spiritual guidance, all of which was celebrated by the Church. Christian doctrine, stemming from foundational scriptures, affirmed the spiritual equality of men and women before God. The book of Genesis states that both male and female were created in God's image. St. Paul's letter to the Galatians famously states, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." This theological principle underpinned the belief that women were equally capable of salvation, grace, and spiritual understanding. It also justified women's participation in monastic life, where they could pursue intellectual and spiritual development with the same fervor as men. These convents provided a unique space for women to live lives dedicated to God and learning, often offering more autonomy than secular society. Within these communities, women could rise to positions of authority as abbesses, manage large monastic institutions, study scripture, produce scholarly works, and engage in mystical contemplation. These were not places of subservience, but of spiritual and intellectual empowerment. Hildegard of Bingen, a prominent abbess, was not only a theologian and mystic, but also composer, scientist, and philosopher, whose intellectual contributions were recognized and respected by male religious and secular leaders. Her visions and writings were endorsed by popes, showing that female spiritual authority was recognized by the highest levels of the Church. Mystical experiences, often a significant part of medieval religiosity, were frequently attributed to women. Figures like Catherine of Siena and Julian of Norwich had profound visions and wrote influential theological works which were widely read and admired. Catherine of Siena acted as a political advisor to popes and kings, using her spiritual authority to influence major political events of her time. Her writings, though written in the vernacular, were sophisticated theological treatises that earned her a place as a doctor of the Church centuries later, a title shared by few women. These women were seen not as inferior, but as divinely inspired conduits of God's word. While it is true that some medieval writings contain misogynistic passages, often reflecting broader societal biases rather than universal religious dogma, these do not represent the entirety of Christian thought or practice. Many medieval men and women viewed women as spiritual equals, capable of great holiness, wisdom, and virtue. The emphasis on Mary, the veneration of numerous female saints, the spiritual equality proclaimed in Scripture, and the opportunities for intellectual and spiritual leadership within convents all demonstrate a much more complex and positive religious view of women than is often portrayed. To claim that medieval Christianity only saw women as evil or inferior ignores the rich tapestry of devotion and theological understanding that uplifted and empowered countless women. Number 3, women had no control over their bodies or reproduction. The idea that medieval women had no agency over their own bodies or reproductive lives is a common assumption, but historical evidence suggests a more nuanced reality. While medical knowledge and societal norms were vastly different from today, women in the Middle Ages actively engaged in practices aimed at controlling their fertility, managing their pregnancies, and seeking care for their bodies, often with the help of other women. Women in medieval society often sought to limit or space their pregnancies, despite a general religious emphasis on procreation. Various methods, often passed down through generations of women, were employed for this purpose. These included prolonged breastfeeding, which can naturally suppress ovulation, as well as the use of herbal remedies believed to have contraceptive or abortifacient properties. While the effectiveness of these remedies varied, their widespread use, documented in medical texts and folklore, indicates a clear desire among women to manage their fertility. Specific herbs like pennyroyal, savin, and rue were commonly cited in medieval medical texts as having effects on the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. Midwives were central figures in women's health and reproductive care. These skilled women, often older and experienced, attended births, provided prenatal and postnatal care, and offered advice on fertility, contraception, and abortion. They were not just delivery assistants, but primary healthcare providers for women, holding a wealth of knowledge about female anatomy and herbal medicine. Records from across Europe show midwives being recognized and even licensed by local authorities, demonstrating their respected and crucial role in communities. Their knowledge was passed down through practice and oral tradition, forming a female-centered network of healthcare. For unwanted pregnancies, historical sources suggest that women sometimes sought to terminate them, again often through herbal means or other traditional methods. While the church condemned abortion, its practice was not uncommon, and women often relied on the secrecy and mutual support of other women to navigate these difficult situations. Court records occasionally reveal cases related to infanticide or attempts at abortion, which, while indicating legal condemnation, also confirm the reality of women seeking to control their reproductive outcomes. The risk involved in such practices highlights the desperation and agency of women facing difficult circumstances. Childbirth itself was an exclusively female domain. Men, including male doctors, were generally excluded from the birthing chamber. This created a space where women supported each other, sharing knowledge and comfort during a vulnerable time. The midwife guided the labor, and female friends and relatives provided emotional and practical support. This collective female experience around birth fostered a sense of community and shared knowledge about women's bodies. Women also held agency regarding their sexual lives within the constraints of their societies. While marriage was the expected norm, records show that women sometimes pursued sexual relationships outside of marriage. Prostitution, though often stigmatized, existed as a recognized, albeit regulated, aspect of urban life in many medieval towns, providing a means of survival for some women and a service for others. Legal records sometimes mention women bringing accusations of rape, indicating that while justice was often imperfect, the concept of bodily autonomy and consent was present, at least in a legal sense, and could be pursued. Furthermore, medieval women had various practices for hygiene and personal care. Archaeological finds and medical texts indicate the use of specific implements for personal hygiene, baths, and various cosmetics and perfumes. Women in noble households had access to more elaborate bathing facilities, but even common women practiced forms of personal cleanliness. Recipes for skincare, hair care, and even remedies for common ailments are found in medieval household manuals, often compiled by or for women. While the framework of medieval society was largely patriarchal and women's choices were undoubtedly limited compared to modern times, it is inaccurate to portray them as entirely lacking control over their bodies. Through knowledge of herbal remedies, the vital role of midwives, and the support networks of other women, medieval women actively sought to manage their fertility, navigate pregnancy and childbirth, and care for their physical well-being. Their agency, though often operating below the surface of official legal and medical discourse, was a significant and active part of their lives. Number 2. Women were always subservient to men, even within marriage. The idea that medieval women were always completely subservient to men, especially within the bounds of marriage, is a pervasive misconception. While medieval society was undeniably patriarchal in its legal and religious frameworks, the practical realities of daily life, particularly within the household, reveal that many women held significant authority, managed complex affairs, and often acted as equal partners with their husbands. Marriage in the Middle Ages, particularly among the peasant and artisan classes, was often a working partnership. Survival depended on the cooperation and division of labor between spouses. The husband might oversee the heaviest farm work or represent the family in public, but the wife was typically the manager of the household economy. This involved much more than just cooking and cleaning. The wife was responsible for managing food supplies, allocating resources, raising children, preparing goods for market, and often handling the family's finances. She might keep the household accounts, manage savings, and decide on daily expenditures. Records from medieval towns and villages show that women frequently handled all the money within the household, even when their husbands earned it. For families running businesses like bakeries, taverns, or craft workshops, the wife was often an indispensable business partner. She would help manage the shop, deal with customers, keep records, and even produce goods herself. In many cases, the wife's contribution was crucial to the success and survival of the enterprise. If the husband died, it was often the wife who continued to run the business, demonstrating her prior active role and expertise. The guild regulations sometimes even allowed a widow to inherit her husband's guild membership and continue his trade, showcasing her recognized skill and standing. Noble marriages, while often arranged for political reasons, also frequently involved a clear division of responsibilities, where the wife held substantial authority within the domestic sphere and over the estate when her husband was absent. A noblewoman managed a large household, which was essentially a small economy in itself. She supervised numerous servants, oversaw the production of food, clothing, and other necessities, and managed the estate's finances. She was responsible for the health and education of her children, and sometimes those of other noble families sent to her court for upbringing. Her role was not merely decorative, but deeply administrative and managerial, requiring intelligence, organization, and a strong will. The concept of head of household did not always translate into absolute male dominance in practice. Legal and religious texts might have placed the husband as the head, but daily life often saw a more egalitarian dynamic. Letters and personal accounts from the period reveal that many couples discussed important decisions together, from property purchases to children's marriages. Their wives frequently offered advice to their husbands, and their opinions were often respected and sought out. The success of the household often depended on the wife's good management and wisdom. Even in religious texts, while patriarchal hierarchy was emphasized, the ideal Christian household often presented roles for both husband and wife that implied mutual respect and complementary responsibility. The wife was often depicted as a strong, wise manager, a virtuous partner who supported her husband and oversaw the moral and practical running of the home. This vision of a productive and harmonious partnership was different from simple, unquestioning subservience. Instances of women asserting their will within marriage are also found in legal records and personal accounts. Women sometimes filed for annulment, sought legal separation, or even openly defied their husbands, though such actions carried risks. The very existence of laws designed to control wives or ensure their obedience suggests that wives were not always perfectly compliant and that their agency had to be managed. The idea of absolute female subservience in medieval marriage is an oversimplification that ignores the practical realities of daily life. While legal and social structures placed men in positions of authority, the functioning of families, farms, and businesses often depended on women's active management, economic contributions, and decision-making power. Many medieval marriages were partnerships where women wielded significant practical authority and respect, making them far from merely passive or subservient figures. Number 1. Women were passive, helpless victims of violence and oppression. The portrayal of medieval women as uniformly passive, helpless victims of violence and constant oppression is a pervasive and unfair stereotype. While medieval society was indeed harsh and violence was more prevalent, historical evidence shows that women were far from always being helpless. They actively engaged in self-defense, resistance, and even warfare, demonstrating courage, resilience, and a remarkable capacity for agency in challenging circumstances. In a world where physical security was often precarious, women were not always weak. Records of medieval crimes and disputes sometimes show women defending themselves, their families, and their property with physical force. They might use domestic tools as weapons or fight back against attackers. While not formally trained soldiers, the need for self-preservation meant many women possessed a practical understanding of how to protect themselves. Legal documents occasionally record women as aggressors or participants in brawls, indicating that they were not always on the receiving end of violence. Beyond individual self-defense, noblewomen often played active roles in defending their castles and estates during sieges when their husbands were absent. They commanded garrisons, organized supplies, and rallied the morale of defenders. Famous examples include Countess Matilda of Tuscany, who led her own armies, and Jeanne de Montfort, who in the 14th century famously donned armor and led troops to defend her castle of Hennebont during the Breton War of Succession, even fighting on the battlefield. Lady Agnes Randolph, known as Black Agnes of Dunbar, famously defended her castle against English siege in the 14th century, taunting her attackers and ensuring her castle withstood the assault for months. These women were not just passive figures within walls, they were strategic military leaders. Women also participated in rebellions and popular uprisings. When economic hardship or injustice became unbearable, women often joined men, or even led, protests against oppressive lords or unfair taxes. They were often at the forefront of food riots, seizing grain from hoarders or attacking corrupt officials, driven by the immediate needs of their families. Their participation was often effective because their perceived weakness or domestic role sometimes meant they were underestimated by authorities, allowing them to take more direct action. The Women's March on Versailles during the French Revolution has medieval parallels in spontaneous women-led protests against grain prices or taxes. For women in religious orders, their defiance of patriarchal expectations or secular interference could be a form of resistance. Abbesses sometimes fiercely defended their monastic communities against encroachment by bishops or noblemen, using legal means, spiritual authority, and political maneuvering to protect their autonomy and property. They were not easily intimidated and often acted as powerful advocates for their communities, even appealing directly to the Pope when necessary. Furthermore, women resisted oppression in more subtle, everyday ways. They might engage in passive resistance, cunning deception, or subtle subversion of patriarchal norms within their households or communities. Stories and legal records describe women who ran away from abusive marriages, defied societal expectations regarding their behavior, or challenged authorities in small but significant ways. The ability to manipulate social norms or use wit to achieve their goals was a form of agency for many women. Even in literature, while often idealized, there are examples of strong, resourceful female characters who take initiative, solve problems, and fight for their own destinies. Figures like Guinevere, though complex, or the resourceful heroines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, show women who are not simply helpless but active agents in their own narratives. The focus on women as solely victims ignores the rich and diverse forms of agency they exercise in the face of challenges. Medieval women were capable of great courage, strategic thinking, and decisive action, whether defending a castle, joining a protest, or simply enduring and protecting their families in a difficult world. Their resilience and capacity for resistance, often overlooked, paint a more accurate picture of their strength and the ways they navigated and shaped their lives within the limitations of their era. They were not merely acted upon, but were active participants in their own histories.